Welcome to the Nemeth Report podcast. I'm Dr. Tammy Nemeth, historian and independent researcher, and I'll be your host. The hydrocarbon and resource industries in Canada, notably in Alberta and Saskatchewan, have undergone tremendous changes over the past 15 years. There's been environmental activism, pushing governments to block pipelines and other infrastructure. There's been the boom and bust of prices. There's been the starving of investment. There's also been the creeping jurisdictional overreach of Ottawa. Brian Zinchuk has covered it all, and he's reported how it's affected the people working in this strategic industry. Brian joined Pipeline News, Saskatchewan's monthly petroleum newspaper, in 2008, serving as journalist and editor until COVID brought it to an end. In 2021, he began his own online publishing venture, Pipeline Online, covering all energy-related news of Saskatchewan. Brian is here today to chat with me about the ongoing challenges facing the energy industry in Saskatchewan and Canada. Welcome to the podcast, Brian.
Good morning. I guess you'd be afternoon where you are.
It's afternoon here, for sure. How are you doing today?
Very good.
Excellent. So my introduction was kind of short, and I'm wondering if you could just take a moment to help the listeners understand who you are and how you came to start Pipeline Online.
So I'm very unique when it comes to journalists, at least in Western Canada, in that I'm likely the only reporter you're going to run into who actually built pipelines. So I spent 3 years proving I could not do calculus and mechanical engineering at the University of Saskatchewan. And after that, I needed work. So my stepdad found me a job of doing union construction pipeline construction, sorry. So I worked on TransCanada, TransGas, Enbridge, and Alliance pipelines. And after all that, I ended up being an excavator operator for a while so I can dig a mean ditch. And it's really important because my perspective is very different than all the other media who think the pipelines, what is that? Oh, they're evil. They're the evil incarnate. It's the devil or Darth Vader. So my perspective is very different on these things when it comes to energy because no one else has been out there and, frozen at 30 below and sweated at 30 above. And you just don't get that. So I often mention that when I'm doing my introductions to people, and it opens doors like you wouldn't believe. In 2008, I was invited to come to Estevan. I was hired. I was recruited within the company I worked with, which was called Glacier Media. They had bought a publication called Pipeline News, and they were reformatting it to become a provincial oil patch newspaper. And I was basically their first hire, employee number one. And we had a number of sales staff, and we had at one point 3 reporters, then 2 reporters, me and another guy. And then the downturn of 2015 happened, and it was down to me as the reporter. And the decline of newspapers. I mean, the Star of Phoenix and Leader Post just announced they're selling their properties. So I knew that the days of newspapers were coming to an end, and I've been preparing for years for that. And when COVID hit, Pipeline News stopped printing, and I had already been well prepared to get ready to launch this new thing, which is pipelineonline.ca. And I built it as Saskatchewan's energy news. Now, whereas Pipeline News was primarily only oil and gas, mostly oil, this is a lot broader than that. While absolutely oil and gas are the bread and butter and the majority of reporting, I also look at a much broader perspective because energy comes from many different sources. It's a power generation, which is huge. I live in Estevan. My next door neighbor drives a drag line. Another neighbor 2 doors over is a miner. The neighbor across the road installs and fixes turbines. And another neighbor 2 doors down from there, he crushes coal at the coal plant. So Estevan also is the center of the Southeast Saskatchewan oil patch, and it's the industry center for that. So they call it the Energy City. So I'm in the right spot for all this. But beyond power generation, because we have coal-fired power generation here, Saskatchewan is building out substantial amounts of wind and soon solar. I do a lot of writing about wind and solar and the battery backups that are supposed to reinforce them. And we can talk about that later if you like, because some pretty interesting numbers from Alberta. nuclear is the most likely place they're going to build a small modular reactor is within about 7 miles from where I live, which I correctly predicted that back in September. And so that's most likely. I'm telling my 15-year-old kid, maybe you might want to find work in this, because by the time it's built, you'll be in your late 20s, and, you could get a career making $200,000 a year working at this plant. So a lot of nuclear stuff, and basically the entire energy gambit. And that includes electric vehicles and the practicality of all this. And we can discuss that if you like later, but everyone's saying, we're all going to be driving electric vehicles by 2035. And that's all you can buy. That's the federal government in Canada has said. You'll only be able to buy electric vehicles, and that's what Ford and GM are starting to work towards. Except that we haven't built out the infrastructure for that. And we can talk about that later if you want.
Okay. That's a really good introduction of your background. And wow, I mean, that's amazing how you've been able to do all those different things and bring your knowledge to how you report. I'm wondering, what has been some of the biggest changes that you've seen happen in the Saskatchewan patch and energy industries?
Well, the downturn that hit at the end of 2014 and really hit in 2015, everyone seems to have forgotten that. You're seeing reports now about, oil companies have seen their profits double in the last year, and they're making so much windfall money. Well, they neglect to mention that the previous 6 years, they all nearly went bankrupt.
Yeah.
And it was very, very tough going. This time of year in February, in 2013, we would have about 100 drilling rigs working in Saskatchewan. And now I think it's around 34. And the highest I've seen in the last few years, I think, was around 46. So that's a decline of over half. And this week is usually the busiest activity for drilling in Saskatchewan, because you can go into areas that are frozen that you can't go into in summertime because they're environmentally sensitive or whatnot, like community pastures, that sort of thing. So what did the industry do? The industry became lean and mean. From 2015 and 16 and 17, I realized there was a trend in talking to people in the industry. And most of the people I talk to are not corporate executives in Calgary who wear ties. Most of the people I speak to own small businesses and have dirt under their fingernails. They actually work for a living, I like to say. They're not the corporate executives. In fact, if I can go a month without voting in Calgary, I'm a happy guy, because it meant I've actually been talking to the people who do the work. The common conception in Toronto and in the broader world is that the oil patch is, all the oil companies. It's really not, at least not in Saskatchewan. It is the service companies that do the work for the oil companies. So as an example, if I went to a drilling site here, 50 kilometers northwest now, and it was for Crescent Point in the Viewfield Bakken area, which was the hype for many, many years. Not so much these days. And I went on that site, and I had a drilling rig working. Well, that drilling rig would have a crew of 20 working on shifts of 5 per shift, and they would have a company man. They would have a rig manager, so that's 21 for that rig. And then they would have a company man overlooking all that. I'll get back to him in a second. And then you'll have one or two people doing water hauling. And then you'll have 2 geologists and 2 measure well drilling and 2 directional drillers. And then you'll have a bunch of people running trucking in and trucking out, and bit salesmen showing up, and the mud guy and everything. And we add it all up, you're looking at about 40 people are there at some point during that thing, not counting the 30 to 40 it takes to move the rig on site and off the site. And out of all those people, not one of them actually collects a check from Crescent Point directly, because even the company man, who's a company representative for Crescent Point, he is a subcontractor through his own limited liability corporation, Joe's Consulting, and Joe's Consulting contracts to the corporation. So while his corporation is paid by Crescent Point, he is not an employee of Crescent Point. So where I go with this is that in Saskatchewan, because we don't have the headquarters here for most companies, Most of the people that are out there in the field are all working for these service companies. And I spend a lot of time talking to them. So where I was going with that is that those people were hit really hard. By 2017, I found that out of 8 out of 10 people I spoke to, they had laid off half of their staff.
Oh my gosh.
And those staff that stayed around, their total remuneration dropped by, on average, about half. Because all the bonuses were gone, all the overtime was gone, they were furloughed a lot, dramatically reduced hours. So the total pay that went into the local communities dropped by almost 75%. And that's a big hit. And that lasted for at least 5 years. And then COVID hit. And when COVID hit, it got even worse. And everything just shut down in the spring and summer of 2020. So I got laid off from Pipeline News. And I posted on Facebook that I'd been laid off. And that was on Monday night. And I got an email the next day. I actually didn't notice it till the day after, but it was from the Premier's office asking me to do some consulting for the province, because I found out later that they had actually relied very heavily on the reporting I did to know what's happening in the service industry, because they talk to oil companies, but they don't talk to the guys doing the work in the field. So they asked me to call everyone I know and ask how you're doing and what can we do to help. What can we, the government of Saskatchewan, do to help? So I built a list of 450 companies, which I figured accounted for about 90% of the activity. And I phoned 152 of them, and 150 of them took my call. And a lot of those were CEO levels for a lot of these things, or company owners and stuff like that. So, one, they were desperate for someone to hear what was going on, but two, they were willing to talk to me. So maybe some people actually think what I'm doing is actually authentic. So that lasted for that summer, and then I went back to work for Glacier for a little bit, then I launched this thing. My point with all of this is that we went through 7 years of absolute hell. We are just coming back. We have not come back to anywhere near the strength we were in 2013 for workforce, whatever. The companies themselves, to stay in operation, had to become much, much more efficient, much leaner. A typical drilling rig today is twice as efficient as it was in 2012. So it gets literally twice as much work done, and not a lot has changed on that rig. They've changed the muds that they use, they changed the drilling bits. But imagine you have a car that gets 30 miles to the gallon, and you bought it in 2012, and now you're getting 40 miles to the gallon with that same car. And that is no exaggeration. That is what the drilling industry has done, which is why there's half as many, or a third as many rigs working today. So that's just some of the things that's been going on right now.
So what did the Saskatchewan government do to help during COVID? Because if they asked you to come up with, giving them some feedback on what the situation was like, what did they do?
So they were leaning on the federal government to get money for what they called an accelerated site closure program, basically well management. And the federal government came forward with $400 million for Saskatchewan and $1 billion for Alberta. And so that didn't help everyone in the sector. In fact, it helped a small portion, but it was a lot better than nothing. One of the things that I asked about, and I can't get into too much detail of what I did for that, but I really reinforced that in the industry, it had been commonplace for oil companies to not pay their bills for 90 days. Didn't matter if they're a multi-billion dollar company, you sent an invoice on January 1st and you might get paid on March 26th. So I strongly suggested that, whoever gets work for this program has to be paid within 30 days. And that was one of the things I believe actually did, for the most part, take place. So anyhow, that was a way to help clean up some environmental headache and get some people to work, and actually drove quite a bit of activity towards tail end.
That's excellent. So, I'm thinking to link this to you were very good in describing what the effect has been on the people working in the industry of the downturn to some extent. And, what's your sense of where you think this is all going? Because, as you said, it's been 7 years of hell, and then there's finally a good year. and everybody's complaining that it's been a good year. So what's your sense of where that's going, that kind of rhetoric? Is it just rhetoric?
Well, I think, especially you're seeing in the UK there, they're talking about, windfall taxes and stuff like that, which is absolutely ludicrous. You just landed Shell moving their headquarters to the UK, and now they want to tax the hell out of them. I mean, killing the golden goose just makes no sense. But like oil prices right now, the reason they went up was because of the war in Ukraine. And I haven't checked today, but last week, oil prices were lower than they were before the war started. And the geopolitical risk of what's going on, as well as the fact that you have about 4.5 million barrels of Russian oil that supposedly isn't on the market, which of course it still is. India is buying a lot of that magically for discount. All that geopolitical risk is gone. So oil prices are, $75, $80 a barrel for WTI. Companies are making money at that. They are no longer making windfall, I'll tell you that. So it's still profitable, but all those windfall dollars, they're gone. And, they're still making, okay, if we see prices drop to $65 a barrel for Western Texas intermediate, we're going to see people cut back their programs. We're going to see layoffs, and we're going to see reduction in spending. So there is no big money being made right now. I mean, there's money being made, but there's no big money.
Do you think this is related to Joe Biden wanting to only fill up the SPR when the oil's around $70 a barrel?
Oh, the SPR. This whole, an interesting thing about the SPR, if you really think about it, they use entirely underground caverns. Do you know why? Because if the Russians dropped a nuke on it, you could still drill a well and pull everything out because none of it burnt because it's all underground. I mean, the entire purpose of the SPR is to get the United States through a war, through a serious war in which they're getting shot at and their ships are getting sunk, and they can't import oil from overseas because, guess what? There's submarines sinking them. That's the purpose for it. Not use SPR because the price of gas is $5 a gallon. Oh my God, the world's coming to an end. The midterms are coming. The Biden administration's use of the SPR was a travesty. It was a mockery of the entire idea of it. As for the price of that, Biden's, schizophrenic when it comes to this. He gives the oil companies hell for not drilling, but then he tells them we're going to phase you out.
Yeah.
So how do you get someone to invest? Every well that's drilled, you're looking at typically $1 million to, so some wells maybe up to $5 million per well, or even $6 million after you frack it, completed, tied in, everything. And that well, you're hoping to get production out of maybe 20 years. But if oil isn't supposed to be, in vogue 12 years from now because we're all driving electric cars, how do you get the investors to say, oh yeah, I will give you the $6 million to drill that well in North Dakota and frack it, when, by the way, we're expecting your industry to disappear. So his actions with all of this are driving investment away. It's not just the United States, it's in Canada as well.
Yeah.
It makes it very difficult to get money. When oil prices were $120 a barrel, all of a sudden, kind of hard to ignore that. And so there was some money coming in. But, I was quite amazed that when we did see oil prices spike to the highest level we've seen since 2013, 2014, that we did not see a flood of drilling in Canada. Not at all. The market should have reacted. We should have seen a whole bunch of drilling rigs go out to work. We should have been flooded with requests to get workers out there. And while there absolutely is a labor shortage, and that's another entirely different conversation here, it was nothing like we saw before. So, it's just, we're in a really weird stage of this whole energy transition. I'm finding I'm spending a lot more time on that than I ever expected. When I launched this, I thought 95% of my story is going to be about, oil production this and drilling that and whatever. And I'm finding I'm spending enormous amounts of my time writing about this whole energy transition as they're talking.
Right, because you've had some really amazing articles about lithium, about the helium, about the first geothermal drilling, about the SMRs. small modular reactors. So what's your take about the energy transition? It looks like Saskatchewan is well positioned to take advantage of the transition the way it's currently being articulated, but also with traditional energy as well. So what's your take about the transition?
So actually, back in December, I took the leader of Saskatchewan opposition, the leader of NDP, for a little tour, and a 2.5 hour drive there and back on the road. So it was about a 40-minute drive out and 40-minute drive back. I was able to show her one of the most densely drilled places for oil near Torquay, Saskatchewan, and 3 miles north of that area, or 5 miles north of it, it was the first lithium well drilled in Saskatchewan, and then 2 miles east of that, the oil stuff, so about 6 miles away, was the first geothermal wells drilled in Saskatchewan, which they just got their funding to go ahead and start developing this. So they want to build a 25 megawatt base load geothermal power system. And then all that's happening literally within a 10-mile radius. So multiple different things. And then lithium here, one thing I want to be clear, lithium is not energy. Lithium is used for batteries, which is used to store energy. And a lot of people think, well, you maybe could consume lithium or something like that. No, it's not. It's batteries. It's like building, storage tanks or, batteries for your flashlight. But whether you're for electric cars or against electric cars, every phone, every laptop needs lithium. And some people think, well, there's going to be different formulas and different batteries, and lithium isn't going to be that important. You can't cheat the periodic table. Lithium is the lightest metal, period. You will never change that as long as the universe exists. So if you need a metal, and weight is a factor, which it is for almost everything, except for stationary items, like maybe grid scale batteries don't need to be lithium because they're not moving. But if it's a car, if it's a plane, if it's something in your pocket, it's a laptop in your backpack, you need the lightest metal around, that's lithium. And it turns out the reason that we're looking at developing this, and this may be important for listeners to know, most lithium in the world is developed one of two ways. One, they chip it out of hard rock and they process it as a hard rock mine. Or number two, in South America, they have a lot of these lithium-rich brines, and they put them in these enormous ponds that cover many square miles, and it takes 18 to 24 months of them evaporating in a very dry atmosphere to eventually get the liquid dense enough of lithium to start extracting it. So looking huge footprints. So one is you dig a great big hole, it's going to be a big hole forever with the spill and all that. The other one is you have these giant evaporation ponds, takes years to process. And the third one, which is just emerging, is what we're looking at in Saskatchewan and Alberta, and as well as the United States, is it turns out that when you produce oil, there's a lot of water that comes up of it. In fact, a typical well might start at 60% oil, and after a few years might be 98% water. Well, it turns out that some of those waters in different formations have concentrations of lithium dissolved within the salty part. That's water from ancient oceans from literally 400 million years ago. And depending on how that ocean went away, depends on how much lithium there is. Well, it turns out in Saskatchewan, there is a deeper formation. It's deeper than the Bakken, which you may have heard of. It's called the Duperel. Same formation in Alberta is called the Leduc. And the Leduc number 1 was the first gusher in Western Canada. It's the one just south of Edmonton. It started the entire major oil rush in the mid-40s. Well, it turns out that the Duperel Formation, which doesn't have oil in Saskatchewan, not much of it, has substantial concentrations of lithium. So there's a number of companies, and I'm doing this big series on it. I'm on story number 14 out of like 22, talking about lithium in Saskatchewan and how it's all happening. They're looking at pumping out this very salty water and running it through a processing system to extract lithium out of that brine. And instead of taking 18 to 24 months, they can literally pull it out of the brine within minutes, like 10, 15 minutes from the time it comes out to the time we're starting to pump it back down. So that's reliant on an emerging technology called DLE, or direct lithium extraction. No one's really commercialized that yet, but we may see big news hopefully within a year or two. And if they do figure that out, the analogy I've used is that in 1903, someone was going to invent the airplane. There were people in the United States, in Germany, in New Zealand. Someone was going to invent it. There's actually a guy in New Zealand who may have flown before the Wright brothers. It was just a matter of time. And eventually two guys who had a bicycle factory, or a bicycle plant that they made bicycles in Dayton, Ohio, went out to Kitty Hawk and they invented the airplane. And now we fly. And, 60 years later, you had the Concorde. So DLE has something like 70 different companies working on, making it happen. So someone is going to figure it out. And some sounds like they're pretty close. And the companies I've been talking to, a few of them hope that they'll be producing their first commercial lithium within 2 to 3 years. And if that's the case, lithium prices went from 10 years ago, they went from about $2,000 a ton to $7,000 a ton. And then in 2021, they went to $21,000 a ton. And in by spring of 22, they went up to $65,000 a ton. I've been floating between 65 and 75,000. It's not going to stay that high. Everyone expects it's going to drop to 20,000 once these other resources come available. But it's one of those things where Saskatchewan may be one of the absolute leaders in this, because when it comes to oil development, a lot of people tell me Alberta has the better rocks. But when it comes to lithium development, Saskatchewan has the better rocks. So that is a very exciting thing. And to produce it, it looks almost exactly like an oil facility, or it will look like an oil facility. It's drilled with a oil drilling rig. It's completed with a oil service rig. All the crews that come from the oil patch, all the geologists, all the skills, everything is oil people, oil companies, oil technologies, but will be used to produce lithium. And the environmental footprint will be compared to one of those other giant mines. It'll be like the period at the end of a sentence.
Right. So I have two questions regarding that. So can this direct lithium extraction be deployed onto the types of essentially tailings ponds that they use down in South America? Could it be used in that? And well, I'll let you answer that bit first.
I actually asked someone about that yesterday, and that is being seriously looked at. So this may totally, and I don't know much about this, so I can't speak to great detail, but the guy spoke to yesterday, one of the CEOs working on this, he said that they are looking at using that in South America. So that technology may revolutionize the South American one, but I don't know.
Right.
So
okay.
That is a possibility. It could dramatically change that as well. It all comes to costs and concentrations.
Right. I mean, that would be just so beneficial to reduce the footprint of the large ponds that they use to evaporate it out. So then my second question is related to education, because you say that you have the geologists and the various petroleum engineers and whatnot who work on the lithium. So there's been a lot of encouragement at the universities to not pursue those types of degrees because fossil fuels are bad. But yet we're still going to need those types of engineers in order to help extract lithium and other things that is said to be needed for the net zero transition. So what's your position, or do you have any knowledge about the level of education required for this kind of development?
So lithium is very much at the forefront, as I said. A lot of the stuff people really don't know yet. And it's, I'm writing a lot about it because it is very new and it's an interesting field. Regarding the education part, and the whole brainwashing that oil is going away. Well, my shirt was made from oil. Your shirt probably was too. Certain lenses on my glasses and your glasses came from plastic. The whole concept that oil and gas is going to disappear in 13 years is absolutely insane. Look at what Germany has done with their energy wind. I think it's pronounced. I can't pronounce. Their whole idea of going to wind and solar, we're going to be entirely renewable. How's that working out for you there, Germany? They're firing up their coal plants. The total percentage of renewables for actual energy generation in Germany has hardly moved the needle despite trillions of dollars being spent. So the idea that oil is going to go away, we don't need it anymore, so we shouldn't pursue a career in it, it's a fool's errand. I mean, it's wishful thinking. A lot of people who hear that stuff in our industry, they refer to it as unicorn farts. Are we going to power the world on unicorn farts? Well, one, there's no unicorns in existence, so we can't capture their farts. But it's magical gas.
So what would you say to young people then who are, like you said, you're 15-year-old, maybe trying to think of future careers and whatnot? What would be your message to them about these kinds of things?
Well, I got a daughter that's 18, and she is currently in school to be a mechanic. She worked the summer at a oil field construction company that does dirt work and cranes out of Weyburn, Saskatchewan. She is very likely going to be going there to do her apprenticeship to get her journeyman mechanic in light duty and then in heavy duty to continue doing that. And she's looking at doing that for the next 30-some years. So, and she wants to work in the oil patch. One of the reasons why is she recognizes that there's opportunity there that other people are going to forego. And she will probably never be short of work. Once she gets her journeyman certificate, she can basically do whatever she wants. There's so few people going into the trades right now. That's why I'm telling both my kids to go into the trades. And it's one of those things that everyone's brainwashed to go to university. I was one of them. You have to go to university. And there's just no other thought. Well, it turns out that there's so few tradespeople now, and so many of the people that were in the trades were in their 50s and 60s, and a lot of them left during the COVID thing. And the baby boomers have now all but retired. And that's a whole demographic discussion that's really impacting the entire industry as well as the entire economy. We saw COVID masked the mass retirement of the baby boomers. And we have so many of them gone from the workplace now, and we have so few people being born in Canada. The reality is that we are tremendously short every year. And the only way to address this, and I'm actually helping out with some of this, is to bring in mass numbers of immigrants. Because even if you went to a bar and found a woman you didn't like and had a kid, it's still going to take 19 years before that kid's going to be in the workforce. So we cannot, produce the babies in time to do this. Our birth rate in Canada, if you believe this, in 2021 hit 1.4 per woman. And you need 2.1 to maintain population. So as soon as you drop below that, you start seeing population decline. When you hit 1.4, you start getting into terminal decline. And without large numbers of immigrants or refugees, which are immigrants, your population starts having issues that the oil patch is seeing right now. SAS Power is seeing. I'm talking to people who are involved with SAS Power here and through the unions and whatnot, and they can't keep people. And it's getting to the point where, we are going to be in a situation, if it continues on this path, where we literally won't have enough people to keep the power plants running because they've either retired or left. And we need to train people to do this. And we need to retain people, and we need to pay them to stick around. And we need to tell them, oh, by the way, we're not going to legislate your job out of existence. And that's one of the huge impacts for coal right now, is that anyone who knows what's going on, including following what I've been writing, realizes that ship is sinking, so I better get off it. SAS Power, just in January 1st, started paying their workers at the coal facility at Coronach, Saskatchewan, a bonus of $360 a month. Please don't leave. We'll give you $360 extra just for staying. Okay, wow. A retention bonus. And the analogy, which is quite apt, is the rats want to flee the sinking ship. I mean, that is the reality of what's happening with coal and everything. Talking about the energy transition here, we maybe touch on wind a little bit.
Sure.
All right, so SaskPower currently has 617 megawatts of wind generation attached to the grid. Almost all of that is through independent power producers who are contracted to sell their power into the grid. And SaskPower, being totally integrated as a Crown corporation, does not release detailed data. In fact, they release next to no data until September because I've been writing a series of stories about how Alberta releases data minute by minute for every generation facility in the entire province. And through the Alberta Electric System Operator, because that's a deregulated system. And what I discovered at Christmas time a year ago is it was a very cold day, it was minus 30, and I looked up Alberta's generation. At that time, they had 2,700 megawatts of wind generation. And at that very moment I looked, they were getting 3 megawatts out of 2,700. And in the past year, that 2,700 has become 3,618. And there have been times, I've written this story 10 times in the last 6 months, where Alberta's wind has dropped to 20 or less. One time, again, it was down to 3 megawatts out of 3,600 megawatts. So we're talking 0.1%, 1 out of 1,000 megawatts of generation capacity. Now, some people say, well, we know it doesn't blow sometimes. Okay, but that means that for every single megawatt of both wind and solar that you build onto the grid, you absolutely have to build a backup of something else, which is usually natural gas. Oh, we want to get rid of natural gas power generation, the federal government says. By 2035, they're saying no more natural gas power generation. Well, how do you do that if we build thousands of megawatts and at any given day it just decides to not blow at a random time for a random length of time? And in Saskatchewan, the data they put out is an average for the whole day, and they put it out 2 days later. And in January, we had 4 days in a row where we had 23 megawatts, -1 megawatt, -1 megawatt, and 2 megawatts for the average production out of 617. So effectively 4 days of no wind power generation at all. How do you survive in a climate where it gets to minus 37 for wind chill up to minus 60 when your power generation decides, sorry, not going to work today. And if it gets below minus 30, they have to shut the wind turbines down because they will shatter because it'll be too cold from cold brittle behavior materials. That's some of that science stuff I learned from engineering when I flunked out. So SaskPower is bound and determined to follow Alberta in this. Alberta's been building massive amounts of wind and solar. Saskatchewan's talking about building 3,000 megawatts of wind and solar. On a typical day, our total generation for the whole province is 3,200 megawatts. So if we do build all this wind and solar, what happens when it stops blowing? And when these days when it does stop blowing, it doesn't stop in just one area. It stops across the entire province. Now, just to put in perspective, Saskatchewan is the size of Germany. And when you don't have wind blowing the entire width of that, that's an issue. Same thing for Alberta. When it stops, and most of the wind is in the south. The area where most of the wind generation is the size of the Benelux countries. And not a puff of wind for hours at a time. The example I use is that imagine you have wind is like power generation is infrastructure. You cannot run your economy without infrastructure. Imagine if every bridge in the entire country of Germany, for instance, or the province of Saskatchewan, decided at a random time at 3 in the afternoon on a Tuesday to all fall into the respective river. And you couldn't use one bridge in the entire jurisdiction for 3 hours, 5 hours, 4 days. And then all of a sudden, they start working and the bridges magically reappear. Well, that is what wind power is. So I've been beating this drum really hard for over a year now because people need to understand you can't run an economy on a power generation system that is so intermittent that it simply cannot be trusted to run grandma's oxygen generator.
Exactly, especially in extreme climates like Saskatchewan, which, as you point out, it's the middle of winter when they get those calm periods. And that's when you need the energy the most to keep your furnace running, And if they have to switch everything over to electric, that's going to be a big deal. And I just wanted to clarify something for the listeners. When Brian was talking about the amount of megawatts of wind, he's talking about nameplate capacity, because there's the nameplate, what it could produce if all conditions were amazing. And then there's the reality of what it actually produces. And one of the terrible things that I've experienced here in Europe, whether it be in Germany or the UK, is that there's always energy spikes on the grid, which then is a problem for the houses and whatnot. We used to have light bulbs exploding all the time in Germany, which was annoying. Yeah. We spend like this an enormous amount of money on these special LED lights, and they would explode. So, I mean,
what does it do for your computer?
Well, exactly. We would have the power supply backups or whatever for the computers in order to ensure that they wouldn't be affected. But we couldn't put the whole house on that. And so when it comes to wind, I think there's really a maximum capacity that can be brought onto the grid, and it kind of maxes out at around 20 or 30% unless you've got massive amounts of backup. And as you point out, it has to be something reliable. Now, I know they talk a lot about these huge battery backups, but if you think about it, what happens to a car battery when it's minus 35, minus 40, and it's not plugged in? And so now you want to have these huge battery things to back up the wind when it's not blowing in the middle of winter. It's really not feasible. And what I'd like to know is, has Sask Power done a real cost-benefit analysis of what having wind and solar and battery backups will actually, what's the cost-benefit analysis of that for the Saskatchewan economy related to having reliable coal and natural gas there?
I'm sure they've done it. I haven't actually had them tell me anything specific about that. I'm often told where wind is so cheap. It's so cheap. And this is one of the things that, some people might say, oh, Brian, you're biased. This is what I tell them. This is my bias. My wife is an emergency room nurse. And so you have a 1 in 4 chance you go into the emergency room in Saskatchewan, she will be the one working on you. And on any given day, it could be your grandmother or you having CPR done on you by her. I don't want the lights to go out. That's simple. I don't want us to ever be in a situation like Alberta put themselves in a grid alert 3 times in December saying, well, don't use your electric frying pan at supper time because we don't have enough power. Alberta has more coal than God, and more natural gas, more oil, has the 3rd largest oil reserves on the entire planet. How is the most energy-rich jurisdiction on the planet short on power? How can we ever allow that to happen? I don't want that to happen in Saskatchewan. I don't want that to happen anywhere. But sure as hell should not happen in energy-rich jurisdictions. In regards to batteries, okay, and you talked about something, the common perception is that the public are told, well, we're going to build all these renewables, and then we're going to build all these massive batteries so that when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, we'll just turn on the battery. And those batteries have to stay warm, as you say, because batteries lose 50% of their capacity when they stay cold. So that means no matter what, they're always drawing power to A, stay charged, and B, stay warm. I mean, it'd be a huge amount of power, but they're always drawing power. Alberta has built 4 of these batteries, and the 5th one just went online like last week. 3 of them are 20 megawatts, and 1 of them is 10 megawatts. So prior to a meeting of Sask Power back in late November, I looked at a website called dispatcho.app, which logs all the minute-by-minute data for all of Alberta. And it turns out that if you took the total number of minutes in a month and you multiplied it by the 4 batteries, and so that would be the possible amount of service minutes they could be online, the month of November was 43,200 minutes they could have been online cumulatively. Take a guess how much power they submitted power to the grid during those 43,200 minutes.
18 minutes.
You're not really quite there, but it was 339. 339 out of 43,000. And oh, by the way, those battery plants cost somewhere between $16 and $26 million each. So SaskPower is building a 20 megawatt one for $26 million. So what they're actually used for is they're used for 20 minutes at a time on average, sometimes an hour, one instance of 3 hours in that month to level off the spikes, usually around supper time. But just for minutes, mere minutes. They're not running all night because this wind didn't blow. They're not being used anywhere in the capacity that the public perceives that they are. And the federal government, I haven't had a chance to write this yet, they just announced $50 million for a project in Ontario. And so I'll be looking at that this afternoon and talking about this and probably use some of those stats in this. Because that is what people are being sold, but it's a bill of goods. It's not reality. And then if you are looking at doing grid scale battery on a massive basis, where you're expecting to use it for 6 hours a night, every night, that means you have to have extra capacity during the daytime to that scale, at least, actually more so because of thermodynamics, entropy, and all that stuff. You need extra power because they're always going to lose some. So, let's say, for instance, I want 100 megawatts of power from solar for the entire day. Okay? And Alberta's got, 2,000 megawatts of solar, something like that right now. So let's say I want a consistent 100 megawatts of solar. Well, in December, and I've looked at these numbers, solar produces, I think it was 4 hours of 100% capacity and another 2 hours of 50% capacity in middle of December. Okay, I might be up by 2 hours now, but let's say you get 6 hours of usable solar. I think that's what it was in the day. That means you need your solar generation to have enough to charge your batteries to run it over the night. You have to have 500 megawatts of solar capturing 100% efficiency for throughout the 6 hours of a day to capture enough to charge the batteries that are 100% efficient to run through the evening, night, and morning until the sun comes back up again. So you need 600 megawatts of solar in December plus 500 megawatts worth of battery storage just to have 100 megawatts on the grid in December in Alberta. That's the math.
Wow. So that also relates to the federal government Clean Power Plan, which they're still apparently negotiating. They haven't, finalized exactly what they want to do. And you point out quite correctly that in an energy-rich jurisdiction, they should be able to use that abundant resource that we have. And I'm concerned about what this means for Saskatchewan, because we're being pushed down this road where we're not supposed to use coal, we're not supposed to use natural gas. And yet you see, for example, there was a news article today that Pakistan was going to exponentially increase the amount of coal power plants that they have because they've run into difficulty securing reliable natural gas. So you have Europe pushing to buy up all the natural gas on the market in order to keep their economies going, which then makes it difficult for developing countries like Pakistan to secure natural gas, which is cleaner in some respects than coal. But if you have clean coal technology, it's, you could get equivalent to natural gas if you employ it. And so here you have Pakistan, which is in financial difficulty. Are they going to build the most energy efficient coal-fired plant out there, or are they going to build the one that's the cheapest, that will burn the cheapest grade coal and pollute more, whatever? So here we are keeping ours in the ground and going down the renewable pathway. And then you have countries like India and Pakistan that are expanding their coal, which will make things worse. So why are we doing it when we have like 1% contribution of emissions to the global emissions numbers, when there's lots of other countries out there who aren't and are much worse than we are?
We're talking about the carbon leakage argument. Peter Zion, I don't know if you've heard of him or not. I follow his stuff very closely, and I have been for a few years now. I've watched and read pretty much everything he's put out publicly, and he talks about that stuff at a great deal. And recently he's been talking about how exactly that Germany threw $500 million in, or $500 billion to buy up basically the entire market of natural gas. Well, guess what? Pakistan, that's their entire economy. They don't have that sort of money to spend on that sort of thing. So they have to go for whatever works. So that didn't really work out very well, did it? We have a similar thing happening here in Saskatchewan in that, the federal government says thou shalt not use coal. We have hundreds of years of coal reserves around Estevan at current consumption rates. And nope, you can't use it. We got to shut it down within a few years. And I predict it won't be 2029. It's going to be more like 2025, 2026, because the carbon tax is going to make it so unaffordable that they're going to have to shut down coal and perhaps convert to natural gas usage. So in the meantime, we've signed an agreement with the Southwest Power Pool, which is basically every power producer from the Canadian border, North Dakota, all the way to northern Texas. And on any given day, they may be up to 50 or 60% wind, but also on any other given day, they're up to 44% coal. So, especially in the evening, I've looked many times, oh, wow, it's 43% coal generation in that power pool. So that means we're going to shut down the 2 coal power plants, like next 6 miles each from my house. My coal miner neighbors are going to lose their jobs so that we are pure in our intentions of having emissions-free power generation, and we're going to buy it from the United States, 44% coal, which is actually a higher percentage than Saskatchewan on any given day. And we'll use that power without paying carbon tax on it. And we'll be, our souls will be pure as a result in the religion of climate change.
So where does the Saskatchewan First Act come into play?
Well,
with respect to this?
You mentioned that because I was going to lead into that there. The whole idea of the Saskatchewan First Act, and if you've actually read it, and I wasn't able to make it to the announcement of it, and it actually worked out better because I ended up reading the act, whereas the other reporters did not. And there's 3 key points to that act. And it's very significant that our premier is an agronomist, someone who specializes in farming, because that's key to the 3rd point. So the first point is all about power generation, and it says that we are going to regulate our emission standards when it comes to power generation, including what fuel we're going to use. So theoretically, we pass the act, Saskatchewan could say, we're going to keep using coal. They're not going to, but they could. Okay?
They could, yeah.
They could. And the federal government is going to say, well, we don't allow that, and Saskatchewan's going to say, well, this is what our act says, and then you have a fight like this. Saskatchewan has largely given up on coal. You can see it from all aspects, from SaskPower's presentations. One of the things about carbon capture, and you referenced that, and I've written more about carbon capture than any other reporter in Saskatchewan. I was there for the announcement when they said, go ahead. And this is key. I actually looked up the story when I wrote that. The minister said, we're going to capture 1 million tons of CO2 per year. And they actually had a billboard on the highway outside of Estevan saying, we're going to capture 1 million tons of CO2 per year, and it is going to be the equivalent of 250,000 vehicles taken off the road. Well, they've spent over 8 years at it, and the best they've ever got, which was last year, was 749,000 tons, which was 3/4 of promised performance. And it was a lot lower than that in previous years, but it's still, 1/4 short of promised performance. So I've been asking for a decade, when are you going to do the next project? Are you going to put carbon capture on the next units of that power plant? Are you going to put it on the other power plant, Shan Power Station? And, it was always like, oh, we're putting off that decision. And finally decided that we weren't going to put it on units 4 and 5. And then they decided last summer, which I reported on, they're not going to do any more carbon capture on coal. And the reason why is that, yes, carbon capture works, but it didn't work to the extent that it was promised. Okay? So, yeah, It's kind of like your teenager. They get the job done, but they don't do it, to the level of someone who actually knows what they're doing. And, then you have to go and wash the dishes again, sort of thing, to use a bad analogy. But the reality is that, yes, carbon capture, we've been doing it. It does work. If we had done several iterations of it, version 2, version 3, we probably would have got the efficiency a lot higher. In 2018, SaskPower did a serious study on putting it onto the Shan power station, which was 4 years after the first one. So here's all the lessons we learned. If we did version 2 on the Shan power station, we can do it for, we figure, half the cost. We'll spend the same amount of money, but have twice the capacity. And we can do that. And they never did. And that was, 4.5 years ago. If they had gone ahead of that, and then we're looking at version 3, perhaps we would be hitting 90% or 100% of promised performance. But
so why do you think they didn't go forward? Was it because they'd already seen the writing on the wall with the federal climate plans?
Absolutely. I think that's number one. Number two, it was a big risk. Okay. It was the original budget announced on the day it was announced was $1.24 billion. Well, $1.24 billion became $1.6 billion. And that wasn't largely for the construction of the carbon capture plant. It was large part because they were refitting the old power plant and they had to spend a lot more than they thought. Asbestos being one of the issues.
Yeah.
So it was over budget, and the provincial government and SaskPower wore political egg on their face for years. This thing did not perform as well as hoped. Well, it performed, it did not perform as well as hoped, and it was over budget and over time, which is pretty much every power facility ever built in the world.
Yeah, exactly.
But that was, one of the things. There was a lot of political hell paid for that. And so if they're going to do it again, we want to make damn sure it's going to work. And, they just couldn't cross that bridge. Are we going to spend another couple $1 billion on it? Now, you may look at the cost of nuclear and everything else and say, coal is pretty cheap. Saskatchewan's unique, at least in Canada and perhaps in the world, in that the Crown or the government, the people of Saskatchewan own most of the coal that's currently being mined. About 75% of the coal is owned by the government. So we, the people, own that coal, and then we, the people, own the power corporation. And so the people who mine the coal that we hire to mine our coal, they pay a royalty for that coal. That royalty is a rounding error. It's in 2018, it was $32 million a year. It's basically nothing. Okay, they spend more on probably toilet paper than they do on the actual cost of the coal. So we don't charge ourselves hardly anything for the coal that we use to keep our lights on. We pay a third of $1 billion to mine the coal, but for the coal itself, we pay next to nothing. So it's essentially free. And even then, because of the ever-escalating carbon tax, we can't make the math work to keep burning coal. So it's that first act, you mentioned that. The government of Saskatchewan, as I said, is looking pretty much giving up on coal, further coal, and maintaining this coal beyond a few more years. So what they've put all their eggs in was the basket of natural gas. So they started building natural gas power plants. They built one at Swift Current, 340 megawatts. They're building another one at Moose Jaw to go online, I think, in a year or two, and that's 360 megawatts. And they're going to build another one eventually at Lanigan, another 370 megawatts. And so we've been building all this natural gas to replace coal. And then the federal government comes along with the Clean Electricity Standard, which is still in discussion phase, saying, oh, well, thou shalt not use natural gas either by 2035, except for exceptional circumstances. And province of Saskatchewan goes, on any given day between coal and natural gas, we're using up to 84% fossil fuels. And if we replace all our coal with natural gas, because on those minus 30 days, when the wind doesn't blow, or you have to shut down wind turbines, and oh, by the way, it's dark because the sun doesn't shine at night, how do we keep our economy going? This is an existential question. This isn't hyperbole. How do we keep our people alive if we have to shut down natural gas? And the answer is, we can't. We simply can't. And yet the federal government says, well, that's what you have to do. And Saskatchewan signed on to the Memorandum of Understanding to build small modular reactors. So yes, we are on that path. Yes, we've said we're going to build 4 of these, more than anyone else in Canada, which will essentially replace our coal fleet. That's not enough for what we need for our grid. That's going to essentially replace our coal fleet. And if we build those, it's going to take, we're going to start on them in the 2030s and finish the last one in the mid-2040s. Well, in the meantime, my wife still needs power for her defibrillator. Okay, and the lights will stay on when she's working on people. And grandma still needs power for her oxygen generator because she has COPD. And the factories and the stores and the schools and the hospitals, they all need power. But if we follow to the letter what the federal government wants us to do, we literally have to turn the lights off for 7 out of 8 people in Saskatchewan in 12 years.
Yeah.
How do you do that? You don't. So then the question becomes, getting real serious here. Is the federal government going to walk in with the Canadian Army and shut down those plants?
Exactly.
What are they going to do if we say to hell with that, which is actually Premier quoted me on that, saying to hell with that. What are they going to do? What are we going to do? We cannot shut down our power systems because the Fed says, well, we don't like it. We cannot let our people freeze and starve. And Alberta is 90% natural gas power generation on any given day. So what do? They shut down all but 2 of their coal units, and the last 2 coal units were shut down within weeks. I'm not sure what the exact time frame is, but sometime in the next few weeks. So they've followed the federal thing. Let's get rid of coal. Coal's bad. And they went to natural gas. And what are they supposed to do if you have to shut down all natural gas? So this becomes an existential question, because if the federal government says, no, you absolutely must shut down natural gas by 2035, and you have nothing to backfill that, in other words, you haven't built dozens of nuclear power reactors in that 12 years' time, which is impossible, by the way, just shut it off. Well, then you start getting to the question of, if that's what our federal government says, that we have to literally, not jokingly, not figuratively turn off the power, but we have to literally flip the breaker, then we have to become an independent country. Because that's the only answer to that. Either you tell the federal government to pound sand on these policies, or we become our own government, because we cannot let our people starve. So that, and the provincial politicians don't want to take it to that argument. They're not saying it's about independence or anything like that, but that's the logical conclusion, that if Alberta and Saskatchewan, which are so heavily dependent on fossil fuels to keep the lights on, if they're forced to follow these environmental doctrines to get rid of fossil fuels entirely, that is our only option. Either that, or we just, everyone leaves, shut them down.
Well, so there's 2 things. One is that there's lots of people in Eastern Canada who say, hey, Saskatchewan's a flat place. Why don't you just paint it with solar panels and put windmills up everywhere? It'll be fine. There'll be a time of day when the sun is shining and you can build the batteries, and that's what Saskatchewan is good for. And I would say, well, where are you going to plant your crops and get the food if you've covered everything with solar panels? And then the second thing is that do you think there's a possibility that if Saskatchewan were to take the clean electricity standard to court, to the Supreme Court, that they would have a shot at winning?
The Supreme Court has absolutely no concept of sanity. If you took the crime legislation that they threw out, that the Conservatives brought in, and they threw it out for this reason, that reason, there's no actual concept of, what actually the real world is. It's what the Supreme Court would like it is. So I have no faith in the Supreme Court whatsoever when it comes to this sort of thing. None. The fact that the Supreme Court agreed with the carbon tax is proof positive of that. So, as I said before, I didn't expect to be writing about all this stuff. And the last year, these things are come at us left, right, and center. This whole energy transition stuff, and now they're talking about, and there's supposed to be legislation soon about federal energy transition. Okay, well, how's that working out for the coal workers? So I talked to the miners the other day, and I talked to the city of Estevan, talked to the mayor, who was a miner for 40 years himself. The city of Westvan got something like $8 million for economic development to help start other industries to provide more jobs. Not a cent for training. So my neighbor who drives a drag line, if he gets laid off tomorrow because we decide to go to natural gas, because we're shutting down coal, there's no training dollars for him. He gets to go on EI. I think he makes over $200,000 a year. What do you think EI pays? Like $1,400 a month?
Yeah.
It's no comparison. So what do you do with these people? If that is what energy transition is for coal, and coal is just a small part of the employment left because we've reduced it to a rump. In Alberta, it's almost totally gone. Saskatchewan soon will be gone. What do you do with all the oil and gas workers? We say, we don't need oil and gas anymore either. So there's a retraining for you for these new clean jobs. By the way, how many people think actually work at one of these giant wind farms during the day? Maybe one person monitoring thing, maybe two, maybe a few people doing maintenance every so often. Whereas for every oil well drilled, that generally creates one permanent job somewhere in the industry that stays. So that is where are the jobs? What are people going to do? Never mind the practicality of all that. One of the things, and I haven't been able to get these numbers solid yet. When we're talking energy transition, we have to talk about the other end of this, not just the generation side, but the usage side. So, Ford and GM, all their advertisements for Jeep, for instance, and GM at the Super Bowl, they're all about, look at all our electric vehicles we're having. We're all going electric.
Yeah.
Well, in Saskatchewan, unless you live in Regina or Saskatoon, you probably drive a pickup truck. I did a series of stories a few years ago, talked to every dealer in Southeast Saskatchewan. 90% of the sales are trucks. And you go to a parking lot, it's almost all trucks. So the Ford electric, it's called the Lightning, their EV pickup truck. This is a half ton. This isn't 3/4 ton. This is a 1 ton. So this is a typical truck, but not a big truck. It requires, if you get the extended range version, and no one buys a base model pickup truck, if you get the extended range version, it requires an 80 amp charger on a 100 amp circuit to have enough hours to charge at night. Because you charge it on a standard 32 amp charger, which you'd use for a Tesla. If you run your battery down to 15%, it would take 15 hours to charge. Yeah. Well, how do you do that and go to work and work the next day and charge? There literally are not enough hours in the day. And same thing applies for the Chevrolet electric truck. And Dodge is going to say the same thing because physics is physics. And that's for half tons, not for a bigger truck. So bigger trucks require even more. Well, a typical house in Saskatchewan built before 2000 has 100 amps for the entire house. That's for your stove and your microwave and your daughter's hairdryer and your plasma TV and the computer and the lights and everything else. 100 amps for the whole house, and you never actually use that whole amount. But every time you plug this truck in, it's going to pull 80 amps on that 100 amp circuit, the full 80. So we have, if the federal government is successful by 2035 in saying, well, you won't be able to sell a gasoline truck anymore, they all have to be electric, then everything will have to be replaced eventually for electric. Well, you add that all up, we have over 300,000 pickup trucks in Saskatchewan. So that's the equivalent of adding the charging capacity. The charging capacity needed would be the equivalent of adding 300,000 houses to a population of 1.2 million, which probably only has 600,000 houses in the first place.
Yeah.
Another calculation I've done, and this one, I'm not certain about the math. Remember, I didn't pass my calculus. But I've asked a number of retired engineers to look this over, and they say the numbers are correct. We have a mid-sized refinery in Regina called the Consumers Co-op Refinery, or Regina Refinery Complex. And its nameplate capacity is 130,000 barrels a day. Now, it typically operates around 115,000, but let's say 130. If you took the energy equivalent of 130,000 barrels a day, how many 300 megawatt nuclear reactors do you think you need to replace that?
I have no idea.
30. You need 30 reactors because the energy of 130,000 barrels a day adds up to 9,100 megawatts. Now, there's arguments to be made where gasoline vehicles aren't as efficient as electric vehicles, so maybe you need 15 reactors. But the reality is that any way you slice it, you need to dramatically increase, and most numbers I've seen, you basically need to double the electrical grid across the entire continent. So while SaskPower is doing that, every other power generation utility needs to do that. And to carry all those electrons, you need to double the transmission grid, and you need to double the distribution grid so that people can have enough power, thick enough wires running to their house to charge everything. And you have to do that on every block of every street of every town in every province and state, same time.
Yeah.
So where are the people coming from to do the wiring? So I'm telling my kid, you better be an electrician. Quite literally. The linemen to put all the infrastructure in. Where's the copper coming from? The aluminum for the power lines? And do you see massive programs to build all this grid? No. You know, they absolutely have to happen if the federal government's energy policies by 2035 will come into place. Because if they don't, we won't have the power for all those EVs.
Well, it's not just the EVs, it's everything. So if you have a natural gas furnace that's supposed to be electric, anything that's run on natural gas or petroleum in general, all of that has to go to electric. And you're right. I mean, I saw this study talking about how we just don't have enough minerals to do what they're proposing we do. Because it's not just Canada doing this. It's the United States doing it. It's Europe doing it. It's the UK doing it. It's Japan doing it. It's South Korea doing it. So if all of these different places around the world are all going along the same path, that means we're all competing for the same limited resources. So we're putting ourselves into another position of energy insecurity, thinking that somehow net zero is going to be better for the planet. I just don't see how that is. And I want to run.
Well, the most ironic thing about that is that the United States is really pushing us. Okay, the federal government is really pushing us, the United States. Yeah. And just in the past year or so, there was plans to build a copper mine in Minnesota. Copper is absolutely crucial for all of this. Okay, because it's the most efficient conductor. And they said, well, no, we can't do a copper mine in Minnesota because we might have to cut down a few trees. Because, my God, there's no trees in Minnesota. So I mean, how do you do all these other wonderful things if you have people saying, but you can't do a mine to produce those critical minerals you're talking about? So the mining sector should be going absolutely great guns for all of these things, for copper, for aluminum. Aluminum is basically lightning or electricity in solid form. So you need giant smelters and electrical capacity to make these smelters, to make all the aluminum, to make the transmission lines, to get to the grid, to run to your copper lines to the house. Where is that happening?
So this is I know. So what I wanted to run by you was an idea that, number one, we haven't been having an honest conversation with the Canadian public about where this is going and the practicalities of it. And number two, if they're so committed, if they really believe this is going to work, where's the test case? Where's the little city of 35,000 people that's completely run on renewables, where everything is electric? Show me that this can work. Where's the test case? Because if there's no test case, and now you want to do not just a town, but the whole darn country, you're looking at putting people into extreme energy and food poverty and a dramatic drop in living standard than what people are expecting. So,
well, I mean, don't we see a lot of that in Europe, where Denmark says, today we were 100%, wind power or whatever. Aren't you seeing test cases like that in Scotland? And how's that working out? If their diesel generators backing up their wind turbines?
Exactly.
And Norway, one of the largest oil producers, is most of the new vehicles being sold are EVs. Well, how's that going to work out in a few years? Can you apply that to all of Europe? So maybe Norway is a bit of a test case. They just said that the ferries can't take electric vehicles because if they catch fire, the whole thing will go up in smoke and we can't put it out. How's that going to work out for you? Europe is the closest, I think, to test cases. I don't think we're going to see a test case in Canada anytime soon, or the United States. Can it work in Europe, which is generally a more moderate temperate climate, which has the benefit of the Gulf Stream? Maybe. Can it work elsewhere in the world? Probably not. The only solution to all of these things, at least on the power generation side, not on the distribution or the grid or any of that other stuff, is to go massively nuclear. Like Poland has announced, if you look on, what we call it, I think it's World Nuclear News or something like that, they've announced more reactors in the last year that they're planning on building than I think have been built in Europe in the last 30. Like, it's just insane how much Poland is doing, because they're going whole hog on nuclear.
Yeah.
But you need to do that not just in Poland, you need to do that the entire planet. So that's a lot of uranium Saskatchewan can be doing, but is there even enough capacity to do that much uranium and to build all these reactors at the same time? Is there the workforce to it? Is there the industrial capacity? The number of Poland's talking about, it's like when Khrushchev said that they were pumping up missiles like sausages. Well, they're going to have to make some Polish Kuba-style reactors, because that's what's going to have to happen. It's going to have to happen here as well. As I said, the 4 reactors we're talking about for Saskatchewan just replace our coal. They don't provide enough power to charge all those electric pickup trucks. And like I said, I thought I was going to be doing a lot of reporting about oil. And I've been talking a lot about this other stuff, largely because no one else in the Saskatchewan and perhaps Western Canadian media is. If they are, it's not nearly to the extent of what I'm doing. I mean, they do a 300-word story, and my average story is 2,500 words. So I'm giving the depth that no one else is doing this. And I'm asking the hard questions, and the other reporters kind of looking like, what? But they don't understand, and that's the problem, is we don't have the energy literacy within the media to actually understand what's the difference between a megawatt and a barrel of oil, and how energy is created and conserved and these sort of things. They simply just don't get it. So when they just regurgitate press releases and you don't understand the science behind it, well, I guess it'll all just work out in the end, won't it?
Right, which makes it much easier to convey the narrative and not explain to people, or at least open that conversation. And it comes back to people don't understand the magnitude of what's being proposed and our inability to achieve it. And until we have an conversation where we talk about what is the energy reality, and this goes very strongly to what you say about energy literacy, because the kids in school learn lots about climate change, but they don't learn very much about energy and what it means and the history of transition, and how normally a transition is something that is more organic than something that's being forced by government. So usually it's when there's something better that comes along, not necessarily to replace what there is, but to add to it in a better way. But what we're proposing in Canada and in the West, in the G7, the G20, whatever, is inferior. It's not a better replacement. It certainly isn't better for a modern technological society. So until we have this raising of awareness amongst the public, I think people will just kind of go along. So what do you think is, how can we change this? How can we get that conversation going?
It really is the new religion. Climate change is the new orthodoxy. It is the new religion. And how do you question what is now considered holy? I don't know. I am asking those questions, but I'm just one guy working in small town Saskatchewan. Not enough people are asking those hard questions to say, hey, maybe we need to give our heads a shake. And not just here, but everywhere. And you'd think the Ukraine war and its energy shortages would have really shaken people up, especially in Europe, paying prices that went up by a factor of 6. And, their governments in some cases, I can't speak too much, but Germany subsidized a great deal. But even then, prices still went up. In price shocks like that, they could cause changes. They reopened a lot of coal plants, for instance. Thank God they hadn't been demolished at this point. Sometimes people just need to wake up to what's happening and, try to figure out how are we going to actually do practical things, not the unicorn farts, as I said, but what actually works. So what do we do that actually works? Well, nuclear does work. We've been doing it for 70-some years. I was talking to someone from the government just the other day, and he was a younger guy. He said, well, SMRs are new technology. I'm like, we've been using small reactors in nuclear submarines since the late 50s. And the company that's going to build them for Saskatchewan built those reactors. So they've been doing it for 70 years. I think they know what they're talking about. It's not new. So you have to have, that is the only non-emitting source that makes any sense at all. Until North America builds reactors by the hundreds, none of this is going to work. But that still doesn't solve the fact that you can't have a missile fusion on the back of your DeLorean for nuclear power in your vehicle. There is no real answer for aviation fuel. They're talking about sustainable aviation fuel and whatnot, but the reality is that the energy density, which is something we haven't talked about, for carbon-based fuels has not been met yet. If some magical thing comes up to do it, maybe that'll work. When it comes to airplanes, for instance, one of the benefits of an airplane is as you burn fuel, your plane gets lighter and can fly further because it weighs less. Well, for battery, if you had a battery-powered airplane, as your battery gets used, you don't lose any weight because the battery's all there. So battery-operated planes probably aren't ever going to work. There's a few tests. Oh, wow, we can fly 50 miles. Well, isn't that wonderful? Now, let's go across the continent. Oh, that's not going to work very well. So, and then when it comes to the whole about fossil fuels being used for plastics and everything else, I mean, my desk here, everything within a 2-foot radius that I touch is made out of plastic. Everything. And even the woods, lacquered in oil-based products. How are we going to get rid of that? Are we going to go back to the 19th century? Blacksmiths? And even blacksmiths, they used coal. Sorry, I lost the audio.
So in Europe, they had this concept of the Bauhaus, which was this really trendy furniture stuff that was made in the interwar period in Germany. And so they want to go back to that where we use natural materials for things. And I'm thinking, well, wait a second. They want to use wood, but you're not allowed to cut down any trees. So I'm not sure how these natural materials are going to be employed when you're not allowed to actually harvest them anymore.
Well, in the interwar period, those trees would have been pulled out of the forest by horses. So how much fodder have they got for horses? And who even knows how to run a team of horses these days, and who's going to shovel their horse crap?
Well, apparently the horse crap is supposed to be good for the soil, right?
Someone still has to shovel it.
Yeah.
So, well, I mean, to sum all this up here, what I'm trying to do with Pipeline Online is I post my best story usually at 7 a.m. each day, Monday to Friday. I try to have a few stories throughout the day, use some wire stuff to help fill out some things. But I have a lot of very intelligent columnists who are much smarter than I am, who write from time to time. I've got a geologist who his personal work has resulted in 2 potash mines. I've got the former CEO of Sask Energy has contributed a few times. I've got a guy who runs a service rig company. He's a partner in ownership of a service rig company. Very intelligent people who have voices that are not Brian's. And, can talk about this stuff from experience and knowledge. And that's wonderful. Jim Warren, for instance, from the University of Regina, is probably the only right-wing university professor at that place. Pretty lonely at lunchtime in the cafeteria for him. But, it's a good set of people to read and to, maybe question some of these things we're talking about. So I'm I'm doing this for the long haul. I grew up in Saskatchewan. Most media come to Saskatchewan as a place to stick around for a couple of years and then leave. The press gallery in Regina has about a 30% turnover per year. I'm not going anywhere. I have no plan B. Plan C would be, pushing carts at Walmart. So I'm going to be doing this for the next 15, 20 years. So I'm going to be reporting about every aspect of this. I'm the guy who goes and knocks on doors, goes out into the field, to the drilling rigs, to the pipeline right-of-ways, to the refineries, to the power plants. And I'm going to be doing this for long term. So if people want to see what all this is all about, you can check out pipelineonline.ca.
Thank you so much, Brian, for taking the time to talk with me. That's a great summary. I'll put down in the description links to your pipelineonline.ca and some of your articles on CCUS and whatnot. So I highly encourage everybody to go check out your website. I know you have great stories, and thank you for taking the time to share your perspective with me today.
Thank you very much.